Hello everyone, I'm Alexandra MacDonald, the Commercial Director at SPCK Publishing, and I'd love to welcome you to the book launch for Rage and Hope, a collection of defiant prayers for justice and a better world to commemorate and celebrate 75 years of Christian aid. The book will be published on the 18th of March, which is actually next week, but you saw what it will look like just now on the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Chinny MacDonald and hope that you're going to enjoy this evening as much as I know I'm going to. Chinny, over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good evening and welcome, everyone. We are absolutely delighted that you've come to celebrate with us this evening the launch of our beautiful book. What better way to mark 75 years of fighting against injustice, of seeing the best in humanity and the worst in humanity, of hoping in God despite the brokenness that we see all around us, than creating this tapestry of beautiful prayers of rage and hope. Rage and Hope, 75 Prayers for a Better World is a collaboration of 75 contributors from Britain and Ireland, as well as countries around the world, including Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Brazil, and Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Each writer wrestles with rage and hope and faith in God from their different contexts, each unified by our collective prayers. We are absolutely delighted to have collaborated on this with so many friends of Christian Aid who gave their time to this project. And we're also thankful to SPCK for their wisdom in the project and for publishing the book. So thank you very much. As Alexandra said, it comes out next week, and we would, of course, love you to buy a copy. But today you get to join us in a discussion with some of the key figures who have led Christian Aid over the past 30 years. It's a little bit like a reunion of a band that never actually played together. We'll be hearing some unique and hopefully candid insight into what it's like leading at the forefront of an organisation like ours, and hearing about the hope and the rage that such leadership entails. Throughout the evening, please do post your questions in the Q&A chat box, and my colleague Wendy, who co-authored the book with me, will be able to put them to the panellists at the end of our panel discussion. So at the start of this event, I want us each just to pause and to think, when you look at the world, what is it that causes you to rage? And where is it that you find hope? We are delighted that Dr. Rowan Williams is with us this evening as well. He needs no introduction, but just in case anyone doesn't know, he is the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He was also Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge from 2013 until last year. He's a noted poet and translator of poetry, and apart from Welsh, speaks or reads just 9 other languages. We're also very grateful to have him as Chair of Christian Aid. Dr. Williams will lead us first in a few minutes of reflection on rage, hope, and injustice before we turn to our panel discussion. Rowan.
Thanks so much, Chine, and welcome to all who've joined us. And on behalf of the trustees of Christian Aid, also thanks to SPCK for all that they've done in helping this book appear. Here we are then, celebrating 75 years of Christian Aid, and celebrating it with a book entitled Rage and Hope, as if both of those things were part of our celebration. There's one sense in which we ought to be really quite angry that Christian Aid is 75 years old. The work still needs doing. It's as if often we feel we haven't begun in addressing the systemic injustices and sufferings of the world we're in. But that sense of anger that the work is still so necessary, so urgent, that can be dealt with if we look at it in the spirit of hope. As I said, it sounds a bit odd to say that we should be angry that Christian Aid is 75. Because as a culture, certainly as a Christian culture, we're a bit in two minds about anger, about rage. It's the kind of thing we feel we oughtn't to be exhibiting, in spite of the fact that Jesus himself seems to find no problem in feeling and showing anger. It's really significant that in some of the very oldest versions of St. Mark's Gospel, when Jesus performs his first miracle of healing, we're told not as in the usual translation that he was moved with compassion, but that he was stirred with anger. He looked at someone else's privation, someone else's pain and exclusion, and he was angry about it. There are different kinds of anger, aren't there? There's the anger that comes from frustrated pride, from our failure to get on top of everything and get others and the world generally to fall in with our plans. But there's also the anger that comes from hurt, the bewildered sense of pain and threat. And when we've grown as human beings and Christian human beings to the point where we can feel the pain and the threat of others as if it were our own, then that's when what you might call healing and transforming anger arises. Not the anger of pride, but the anger of pain, the anger of shared pain, the anger that comes from a sense of the privation, the suffering, and the challenge that we actually share. And because that kind of anger comes from a deep awareness of our solidarity, it also puts us in touch with the deepest springs of hope. Because it's human solidarity held together in the embracing, uniting communion of God's love that is always the source of real hope. Not easy come, easy go optimism, but the hope that dares to imagine that things don't have to be this way. The hope that says it's worth doing this, even if it doesn't result immediately in changing everything. That hope and that courage, that visionary willingness to take risks, to do what we know to be right, to witness, all of that comes from solidarity. And as Christians, we believe that the deepest solidarity for human beings has come because our human nature, in its entirety, has been shared by our Creator in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So perhaps those two words, rage and hope, aren't quite so odd or quite so strange to one another as we might at first have thought. Like Jesus in the Gospels, we allow ourselves to feel anger at the suffering, the lack, the struggle of others. Jesus, faced with the leper at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, feels the leper's exclusion, the leper's powerlessness along his nerves. And just as we would react to feeling that we were excluded, disempowered, and despised, so Jesus reacts with that generous anger, which knows that things could be different, and his anger changes things. He acts, you might say, in an absolute hope, knowing how different things could be. And in his life and his death and his resurrection, that's always what's going on. So, as we look back over 75 years of Christian Aid's history, with the help of all these wonderful people who have led the organization through those decades, we can see how those things weave in and out of one another. How again and again, the impulse of anger, the clarity that this should not be so, drives people into action. And also the stories that we share of how people's lives have been transfigured renew our hope day after day, year after year. Will we be celebrating Christian Aid's centenary in 25 years' time? I guess everybody on this call will have mixed feelings for the reasons I've just outlined. There'll be one sense in which it'll be wonderful to celebrate a centenary of generous, committed, professional, imaginative, visionary work. But will there also be a sense that if we're still in business in 25 years' time, something will not have been achieved? Some anger that we still have to work as if we'd barely started on the task of witnessing to God's kingdom and changing lives all around us. The prayers and reflections in this book are meant to feed both of those deep emotional places in us, the place from which anger comes, the place from which hope comes, the place where our solidarity is most real, most full of energy, life, grief, joy, confidence. The energy that will change us as we struggle to change the world around. So, whatever lies ahead in the next 25 years, we can at least pray that that transforming energy of communion, of solidarity, will go on working throughout the whole human world, transforming it day by day, year by year. And meanwhile, even if we feel that bite, that edge of recognizing that 75 years on, we're still doing the same things, we can also give thanks that God has given us the gifts of anger and of confidence, because he goes on giving us the gift of communion, the gift of belonging together, sensing one another's need, feeling one another's exclusion, sharing one another's joy, bearing one another's burdens. In the life of the kingdom, the life of Christ's body, to which our work seeks to witness. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for those words that I'm sure will remain with us throughout this evening and beyond. We're going to be picking up on some of what you said as we turn now to our panelists for the evening. I should introduce myself as well. My name is Chinny MacDonald. I'm Head of Public Engagement at Christian Aid. I'm delighted to have 4 people with me who have led or currently are leading the organisation. So first, Michael Taylor. Michael led Christian Aid from 1985 to 1997. He graduated from Manchester University and Union Theological Seminary in New York, then became a local Baptist minister, theological principal, university lecturer in theology and ethics in Manchester, chair of charities, and professor of social theology in Birmingham. He is still active in issues of climate change, refugees, mental health, and restorative justice, as well as collecting for Christian Aid. So thank you for that, Michael. Loretta Minghella was Chief Executive of Christian Aid from 2010 to 2017. She is now the Church of England's first Church Estates Commissioner and a trustee of the Archbishop's Council. In October 2021, she will become the Master of Clare College, Cambridge. Dr. Daleep Mukarji trained and worked in health and development in India before moving to Geneva to work with the World Council of Churches in mission and social justice. He came to Britain as Director of Christian Aid in 1998 and led the organisation for 12 years. He is now retired and is involved with the Methodist Church. And finally, Amanda Khozi Mukwashi. Amanda is the current CEO of Christian Aid. She has devoted more than 25 years to working on poverty alleviation, tackling injustice and inequalities. She's also held positions in the United Nations, VSO International, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the UNFPA Zambia Country Support Programme on Gender, Population and Development. She has also previously served as a trustee for Bond and as president of Akina Mamawa Africa. She is author of But Where Are You Really From?, also published by SPCK. So now to our panel discussion, and I'll come to Michael first. Michael, I wonder if you might reflect on Dr. Williams's words, what resonated with you in relation to your time leading Christian Aid. Maybe tell us about a moment in which you felt rage at a particular injustice in the world during your time, and potentially when did you feel the most hope? Oh, you are still on mute. Michael, you are still on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
There are lots of things to pick up from Rowan. Thank you very much. Two things struck me. One was his early reference to the persistence of suffering and injustice. And the other was when he introduced the idea of pain into the idea of anger, because I think I connect more with words like lament and pain than I do with anger. So let me just say a word about lament and then about hope and connect them mainly to one story. When it comes to lament, I vividly remember being sent by the folk at Christian Aid to the rainforests of Brazil to visit Chico Mendes, the great pioneer of in the rainforests, who was working with the rubber tappers that we supported at that time, who was struggling to save their way of life as well as save the rainforest, and were bitterly and violently opposed by the developers who was destroying the forest. Chico was a devout Catholic. He took me to one of those base communities where talk about the Bible and talk about the politics seemed to merge into one very heady mixture. And at the end of the visit, where I saw gunmen around in the little town where he lived, he invited me to eat a meal with his wife and two small children in his tiny house with the animals underneath it in the middle of the forest. And to me, it was a little bit like a Eucharist. 2 weeks later, I heard the news that Chico had been shot in front of his wife and his children at that very same table, where, not to be trite, it seemed suddenly as if a Eucharist had turned into a Last Supper. And if anger has anything to do with pain and lament, that's when I certainly felt it, and of course, not the only time. When you turn to hope, I find it a very difficult subject to think about. And going back to Rowan's reference to the persistence of injustice and suffering. Because if you look back, as I unfortunately in some ways and gladly in others do, we've had to look at a lot of reversals. To be a bit indiscreet, maybe the best year was 1990 when Mandela came out of prison and Mrs. Thatcher left Downing Street. But what has happened then has been a series of daunting reversals, not only in Southern Africa, but also in government policies. Obviously the 0.7 becoming the 0.5, and Claire Short fighting for a seat at the cabinet for international development, creating a department of her own. Both of these have now been lost. And in many such stories, there seem to be these sad reversals, not least, of course, in Myanmar, as some of your folk must be well aware. But I do have hope, and what I understand, my understanding of hope, is where I find people who believe that there isn't any situation which can't, with resilience and courage and love, be made better than it is now, and keep on pushing at those doors which are hardly open, but are certainly not completely closed. That's what I experience as hope. And it wasn't long after the lamentable, painful story of Chico's murder in the rainforest in front of his family that somebody sent me a little note to say, if Chico dies, 1,000 Chicos will rise up and take his place. That is the great army of people who persist on pushing at doors because they know that there's never a situation where nothing more can be done.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that. Let's move on to Loretta now. Loretta, your reflections on Rage, Hope and Rowan.
Lovely to be with you this evening, and hard to follow those two. But what Rowan was talking about when he talked about the anger of pain really resonated with me. I remember acutely being in Sierra Leone in 2012 and waiting for our colleague, one of the drivers, to turn up to take us back to Freetown. We were in a remote rural area and we had to listen to the cries of a woman, to cut a long story short, dying in childbirth. The country has a population roughly the size of Scotland. It's rich in natural resources like diamonds and titanium ore, and it has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world. And just by chance, we found ourselves outside a building where a woman was struggling in childbirth and was clearly not going to get help in time, because there just aren't the health systems there that would require. And on the way back to Freetown, we passed a titanium mine, and the environmental degradation was extraordinary. The land was crying out the same way that woman had been crying out. And the resources were there. The country has the resources. It doesn't have the governance. It doesn't have the economic systems. It's a failure of governance, and it's a failure in good corporate behavior. And those things made me really, really angry, as well as sharing in the pain to some extent of what I'd seen during the day. But Rowan is also right when he says that human solidarity is the real source of our hope. And I think then of so many opportunities I had, great opportunities as the Chief Executive of Christian Aid, and one trip in particular to Nicaragua, to the highlands in Nicaragua, meeting a community that we'd helped get a coffee mill going, and meeting the women who worked in the coffee mill. And they told me that this was the one place for miles around, and just think about this when you drink your coffee, this was the one place where a woman over 30 could hope to have a job, because in other coffee mills around about, younger women were required by those in charge. They didn't want to see or sleep with a women as old as 30, they weren't useful and they wouldn't be employed. And these women did have decent employment, and they didn't have to trade anything for it but a good day's work, and they got a good day's pay. And what they did was channel their earnings into their community, not just for their children's education, but health services for other women around them and other resources for their community, because that's what I saw. I saw love replicating itself. And that's what Christian Aid supporters do. They enable Christian Aid to do the work it does that supports communities in loving one another and replicating that love for people around them. And that's what actually gave me the hope and the strength to keep going with dealing with the pain and the anger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loretta. We could kind of delve into some of your experiences and others, but we must move on to Daleep now, and then Amanda. So Daleep.
Thank you, Ginny, and thank you very much, Rowan. It's always fantastically inspiring to listen to you, Rowan. Thank you for reminding us that Jesus got angry. We sometimes feel that Jesus was gentle, Jesus meek and mild, but your reference to Jesus getting upset with the leprosy patient, upset with what was happening in the other situations, is good for us Christians to know that anger is a spirit or an experience that can lead to change and can lead to doing something about what you see around us. And I found that very helpful. For me, getting into this kind of work many years ago as a young medical doctor just out of medical school, working in rural India, I experienced anger when I saw exploitation, when I saw injustice, when I saw the way Dalits were treated and women were treated in rural India. And I decided at that time that I would take up seriously development, social change, and working to educate, empower, and people to help themselves. Throughout my life, I've been involved in that. And coming into Christian Aid, when I was privileged to be offered the role and responsibility of being director, I saw so much more anger. Anger with what's happening in the Middle East, anger with what's happening in Myanmar and still happening in Myanmar, angry with what was happening in so many areas of civil war. Much of this was due to the man-made disasters, I would call them. But also hope came. I joined Christian Aid in April 1998. 3 months later in Birmingham, some of you will remember, many of you may have been there at the G7 meeting when thousands of people were on the streets of Birmingham trying to influence the leaders of the G7 countries to cancel some of the third world debts, the Jubilee 2000 movement. I felt a sense of hope. I sense a sense of a movement, people really wanting to change. A few of us, because we were leaders of the major development agencies, were invited by the then G7 leaders, and Tony Blair, our prime minister, called us in. And I remember talking to him with others, saying to him, "You've got to give us a chance to talk to you directly." And he was too busy. And I said, "Do you realize that 70,000 of your voters are out there, and you better send somebody or come yourself?" And we all said that to him. He did come. And again, 10 years later or so, we met in G7 meeting in 2005 at Gleneagles in Scotland. Again, a great movement for the Make Poverty History, when we were demanding changes in more aid, trade justice, and better things in development. Oh, I've seen so much change in our time. And Michael is also right, sadly, there's been so much reversal too in the last few years. And probably he can remind us that, or he reminded us that it was the Labour government that brought many of the changes linked to the 0.7%, to the international development and to all of that. And I was very happy to work with them. Finally, what inspires me still as a collector and a worker for Christian Aid locally and elsewhere is to see some people still committed, still willing to go on the road, still willing to sign petitions, still willing to go and write to their or meet their member of parliament. We must build this movement for social justice and social change. Together, we can make it a better world. That is my hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daleep. Just before I go to Amanda, after Amanda's spoken, I wonder if, since this is a unique situation where we have all of you in the same Zoom room, if you have any reflections on hearing what each of the other CEOs, directors has said. But over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Chine. And yes, I'm fascinated to hear the reflections from those who have come before me. I think in terms of just where I connect with what Rowan said, I think it's that question that sort of is on my mind now. You know, what are we celebrating? Why are we celebrating? So when we say celebrating 75 years, what is that really about? And it's a bittersweet moment, I think, because on the one hand, we are not celebrating the injustice that has continued, or the fact that there's still a need for us to be there and to do the work that we do. And on the other hand, we are celebrating the fact that there's a whole family of people, a whole movement of people around Christian Aid who are still committed and continue to stand side by side together to continue to challenge the injustices that exist. And so, you know, when I think of that word celebration, thank you, Rowan, for asking the question. In terms of what continues to, you know, I think moments of rage and hope, I have to say that, you know, when you travel on behalf of Christian Aid and you go out to different countries, you visit different people, there's a lot to be angry about, actually. And but there's also quite a lot to be inspired by. And so I just want to reflect on one such visit. I think in 2019, I went to visit Ethiopia in South Omo, so on the south of the country. I met with quite a number of groups of women And what really struck me is that I think it was a time when, you know, back here and in the US, there was a whole conversation around climate denials, right? And people who were saying that climate change doesn't exist. And yet, when I went to South Omo, what I found was that while we were discussing and debating the issues of climate change, the women in South Omo, the people of South Omo, were experiencing it and living it on a day-to-day basis. And so what they were showing me, what they say to me is, you know, Amanda, look, our livestock are dying because there's no water, right? And the droughts are more intense, and they're getting closer and more frequent. And we know that this is because of something that is happening in the world, but we don't know what we've contributed to it. And so I was talking to a group of women who have contributed the least to carbon emissions or to the issue of climate change as it is at the moment. And yet they're struggling and living those experiences. But what really touched me and I think caused me to have rage, really, to be angry, was that it was not just one set of injustice. So there's climate injustice as far as they're concerned that's impacting on them. There's economic injustice because they can't even get jobs. They have no access to healthcare services, little access to education. They're just about managing to get their children to go to some kind of school, if possible. And then there's gender injustice. So those three injustices coming together, and they're having to live that. That's their normal life. And that I think it made me really angry. However, and yet, the more I spoke to them, they were happy. And I was asking myself, why are they happy? What is it that gives them such resilience and such energy? And they talked of the sisterhood, and not just the sisterhood in terms of, you know, being biological, having a biological sister, but the groups that we had helped them to create. And I'm not going to claim that this is all because of Christian Aid. No, but we had worked with them and we had supported them. And those groups, the women were saying, I don't have 2 sisters, I've got 20 sisters. I know that when I'm pregnant and I have to give birth, they're going to be there for my children. They're going to help them to have food. They're going to help them to go to school where possible. And so you have to have hope, you know, because I asked myself, how dare you not have hope in the face of such hope that defies the odds? And I think that's where I get my hope from. And I think the last thing that I would probably say, Chine, is that I guess maybe because I'm originally from Zambia, when I visit these communities, I don't see them as communities. These are my sisters. These are my brothers. These are my aunties. You know, so for me, they're not statistics. When I see them in the eyes of my own communities where I come from as a family. And I have to have hope. And yes, there's a bit of the audacity of hope, but actually you need that hope. And that's what I get from them when I see them succeeding in spite of everything else that's going around. Let me stop there and would love to hear more from the others.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Just want to leave a moment for any reflections on what others have said from Daleep, Loretta, Michael, or Rowan. If not, we can, Michael.
Just say that one thing I noticed about today and my long ago yesterday is some change of vocabulary. The word dignity now heads 4 words that often come in your publicity. And I remember very much that Rowan gave a speech about international development years ago, and the phrase that leapt out of it after we'd had a conversation actually was about dignity. I think he talked about dignity distributed, or the distribution of dignity. And in our day, the language was very much more about power. Now, I know that empowerment can become almost a kind of cliche now, but I think there's a very interesting discussion about the relation between dignity and power. I think lots of people have dignity, but they don't have power. And people can be treated with dignity, but they don't have power. And I still have a very strong gut feeling, I know it's from my upbringing and my teachers, that unless we fundamentally address and we were right in the midst of it, of course, e.g. in the apartheid story and our support for the ANC. I mean, that was a big issue about power, but there are small issues about power as well. So I'm interested in that change of language. It's not a criticism, but there's a kind of shift there, and I'm interested in it.
Thank you. Daleep, any reflections?
I think that Michael has brought up the issue of power. All of us are dealing with the power realities in society, and change is only going to come when we question those who have power and those who don't want to share it or don't give it up. And that's why the language of empowerment is necessary, whether you empower women or workers and all this. And linked to power, and I know this happened during your time, Michael, but it's happened during my time too. Too many people think our work was political. It was not party political. It was political because we were concerned with loving our neighbors and doing good for them and helping them. And that understanding that our mission and our putting our faith into action involves dealing with power and dealing with the politics of social change and the politics of how people live and work and misuse their power is something we in Christian Aid brought in very early. We didn't just want to give help to people through charity. We asked from the very beginning, why are people poor? What are the systems that are keeping people poor? And we can and must do something about it. It upset a lot of people, but it became very normal after some time. And that's what made what I said, gave me hope with the movements around Make Poverty History and Jubilee 2000 and a host of other things that brought people onto the street. But also, and that's what I still see with young people. Don't ever give it up. Our work is also, besides helping people overseas, is helping people in Britain and Ireland see what they can do and to change the world. Not what we, Christian Aid, can do, because that's the people who pray for us, give to us, and can help us move mountains.
Can I just pick up on Daleep's points there? And when he was talking earlier, he was talking about the big mobilizations of Christian Aid supporters in Britain and Ireland. And one of the reflections I have is, even during my time, but since my time, there's been a constriction in Britain and Ireland around civil society space. There's been less opportunity. I mean, in the early days, for me, we were in and out of number 10 all the time. We were in to see secretaries of state about various things, the foreign secretary. In the latter part of my time, the relationship between government and civil society shifted. And I think it has gone on shifting. I'd be really interested to hear about what the current experiences might be. So I think one of the challenges I'm interested in is how we speak about dignity, but don't lose sight of those issues of power and voice, which aren't just matters of power and voice for people in developing countries or where we work with sisters and brothers in the global south, but are very much issues for us here in the global north as well.
Did you want me? Oh, Rowan, sorry.
Oh, sorry, yes, just a very brief comment. I'm very glad that the issue of power has been raised. But I think that people step into their power, into their authority, you might say, when they're also being told that they're worth hearing, when they are given back a confidence to step into that place. And that's where I see dignity and power really, really tightly woven together. And if talking about dignity is a way of making our language more abstract, then we need to look at it very critically. but I think it ought to be part of that general sense of how it is that people trust their own voice and trust their own experience a bit. I was writing something recently about the difference between freedom of choice and freedom of voice. And freedom of voice has real political implications, real transformative implications, I think.
Thank you, Rowan. Just before we move on to Wendy, Amanda, response, thoughts?
I think, Michael, thank you for raising that. I think it's quite provocative in terms of, in a good way, in that I'm hoping that it's going to make us think a little bit more. I wonder whether I really could have dignity without power, and or whether when you say when we look at people and we say they have dignity, is that only half the story, right? Because or are these two sides of the same coin? So my ability to speak up, to have voice, for my own self-esteem, to be respected, to be looked at as a human being that is worthy of that respect and consideration. That for me is dignity, and in that phrase, in that word dignity, implicit in it is power. I think that you're right, though, that we shouldn't speak of one without recognizing that the dismantling of structures that keep people in situations of oppression is part of that power narrative and the dignity narrative. And I think at the moment, currently in our language as Christian Aid, it's very much about both power and dignity. In fact, our global strategy in terms of standing together is about poverty, power, and prophetic voice. So it would be fantastic if we had some other time to interrogate that a little bit more. Because I reckon that I can't have I can't have dignity without power. I think the two have to come together for me to be truly, and this comes across in the race conversation quite a lot. But I can come back to that later, Chine.
Thank you so much. I knew this was going to happen. Time is running away with us. But I'm delighted to see around 180 people on this call. Each of the CEOs has contributed a prayer to this book, Rage and Hope, and it's where you can read more of their reflections about leading Christian Aid and what they rage and hope about. But this wouldn't have been possible without the other contributors, and I'm delighted to see so many of the writers who have been featured in this book here tonight. I wish I could read out all 75 names, but thank you so much for joining with us and partnering with us on this project. We're just going to have just a moment now, a kind of interlude, a moment of prayer, of rage and hope. And so I'm going to hand over to Wendy.
Thank you, Chinny. It was difficult to choose which prayer to use for this interlude. And I've settled on Romy Tionko's prayer, and I think I've spotted Romy perhaps on the call. I hope I do it justice. And it felt pertinent not only to use it because of the power of the words, but also because of the long history that Romy has with Christian Aid. First hearing of Christian Aid in 1979, working with Christian Aid as a partner in residence and as a staff member in the Northwest region. And he's now returned to the Philippines, rejoining Muslim Christian Agency for Advocacy, Relief and Development, where he first heard of Christian Aid. So Romy, thank you for your contribution. Interesting to hear the conversation about power and dignity. Some of the words that Romy has chosen to use in this prayer will feel particularly pertinent, I think, in the context of this conversation. Let us pray. We are the poor. Lord, we are poor. We are wanting in basic needs. We are often hungry because we cannot grow sufficient grains from our fields. We often feel cold. We lack clothes and our houses leak when it rains. The nights come very early because we only have kerosene or candle lights. This offers us some good because no television shows keep us awake. Lord, we are poor. We have very little access to our social needs. We are scared of getting sick because we cannot afford to go to a doctor or hospital. Our children may finish elementary education since the schools are in the village, but higher education is a distant dream, a very distant dream. We have very little access to services and resources. We have very few friends who have influence among those with power. Lord, we are poor. We have no voice. We are powerless. Some well-meaning and kind people have come to help us. They say that they are guided by an old Chinese proverb. Give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Lord, I know how to plough. I know how to plant. I know how to harvest. But I have no access to fertile and flat land. They are in the hands of rich individuals and corporations. I have no access to credit except from usurers. I am not perfect. Teaching me how to fish will improve and increase my knowledge and skills. But what I need most, what farmers like me need, is justice. We need access to the means of production. We need access to credit and services. We need to get together, to organize ourselves and cry out with one voice. If we unite and aim at the same vision, if we unite and dedicate ourselves to fulfill the same mission, if we unite and act together to achieve our shared goals and objectives, someday we will be free. Freed from our fears, freed from our financial debts, freed from our debts of gratitude that enslaves us to the rich and powerful. We will be free to become more fully human, free to become the image and likeness of God. Lord, come and save us. Send us men and women who are driven by the dedication of your Son, his preferential option for the poor. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Wendy, for reading that prayer. I can already see so many great questions coming through in the Q&A chat box. So I wonder if we can take just the last two planned questions and you can take your pick of what you're going to be answering. But two questions: what was or is the greatest challenge that you have been presented with during your time leading Christian Aid? And what is your challenge to the church in a post-COVID world? So if you could take either of those or both in a kind of quick fire answer, and we'll start with Loretta before moving on to Daleep.
Thank you. I'm going to take on the greatest challenge that I was presented with. There were so many challenges, it's a really challenging role. But the biggest challenge I think I had looking back was dealing with the despondency after the Copenhagen Climate Change Summit had resulted in failure and no agreement, because it just seemed everyone was so despondent. They thought the fight for a climate agreement was a lost cause, and other people in the sector just thought they would move on to other campaigns. And inside Christian Aid, it was just when I was just starting, inside Christian Aid, there was a real sense that we couldn't really give up this fight, but we were kind of felt like a lone voice, whereas normally we'd be in quite a big coalition. And it was hard to get some of the other big agencies really alongside us, but we really were listening to our communities and we knew it was so important. So we just told ourselves it was going to be a long haul, and we told ourselves it would probably be years, and we just planned and plotted together and cajoled people to join with us, and our supporters were brilliant, and we plugged away at it. And there were many twists and turns, but in the end we plugged away at it, and we ended up with the Paris Agreement in 2015 that laid so many very, very important foundations for what we're doing now on climate change. So it was a really hard slog for those years. It felt like, a question about whether we were doing the right thing, but I'm so glad that we did it now and that we did plug away, and so grateful to supporters for walking alongside us in that. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. Daleep?
Like others, there have been many challenges one faces as chief executive, and being there for 12 years over the years, I had many problems all over the world that we had to deal with, and different challenges were not easy to deal with. I had excellent colleagues and excellent staff all over the place, and together we did make a difference. But I want to say the challenge that I remember, and the one that saddened me the most, because when I came, we were able to do things in such a way, and the environment was right, that our income grew from about 35 million to about 104 million. And during that time, things went well. But in 2008, with the global financial crisis, we, our partners, and many others were facing this difficulty of funding and financing. And how does one deal with it suddenly? It means restructuring, reorganizing, refocusing. Never easy. Discussing it with colleagues, trying to get people involved. It was painful for many people, but it is also painful for the chief executive to tell some people your work or your activity or even your job was going. And I found that very difficult, both personally, because I had built up relationships with the whole team, and I think they trusted the leadership. But Christian Aid got through it, as we got through so many other things. And I left 2 or 3 years after that in 2012, after trying to put it right and hand it over. So I found 2 things that helped me during the time: the support of the senior colleagues and the sense that the church and our supporters in the field were praying for us, giving to us, and hoping that we would be able to cope with the financial crisis ourselves. It wasn't easy, but I'm glad we got through it.
Wow, thank you, Daleep. These are some big challenges. Michael and then Amanda.
Well, I can feel some of the difficulties the others have mentioned. If I can be perhaps too high-minded, the challenge that I faced was a challenge that I shared with, again, some wonderful colleagues who have remained close friends ever since. And I think it was something to do with being pragmatic, which means making compromises from time to time and using all sorts of methods to raise the wind that Daleep's just been talking about. The challenge is to be pragmatic and worldly wise in a sense, but not to lose the soul of Christian Aid. And that soul can be described in a number of different ways. I think of the high ideals that the World Council held up to us for a long time about how we actually did work with what we called partners rather glibly overseas, how we work with them in respect, with dignity, aware of the issues of power and very self-aware about ownership and committed to mutual accountability and so on. But there's also not losing your soul when you deal with governments, where we don't just become the tool of government policies whilst we we have to work with them and should work with them. There's something about being prophetic, being brave and prophetic out there in a world that can easily turn on you, and it did turn on Christian Aid at 1 or 2 points, including the apartheid issues. And somehow keeping the spirit, if I can put it this way, of a voluntary organization rather than a corporate. And I'm not saying this of Christian Aid, but I do look at the way a lot of the charity world goes, and it seems to be running towards being corporates, being business, much more than the ethos of being voluntary. So I think that was something we all struggled with, and I'm sure you struggle with it now. When it comes to the challenge to the churches, I think I want to echo what Daleep says. The first thing we ought to do is to thank the churches, Some people were a bit iffy about the churches in my day, but when push comes to shove, it's the people from the churches who turn out to ring round the G7 in Birmingham, who turn out on the streets and now on the emails and the Zooms Year by Beer for Christian Aid Week and so on and so forth. But if there is a challenge there, I think I understand the hard times that they face at the moment, and it's quite natural for them to be eyeing how do we maintain our lives. And I think the challenge I would want to say, with the greatest deal of understanding for that difficulty as numbers decline and money declines, that yes, you have got to maintain yourselves and your life and your people, but keep on asking as best you can, what are we maintaining this for? And I hope part of that answer will be for some of the poorest people on God's earth.
Thank you. Amanda.
Thank you. Wow, I think maybe in addition to what my colleagues have said, because quite a lot of things that have been said I can resonate with. So it has been a challenging time. It's been a challenging period. I guess maybe the challenge that I would share is, I think, leading an organization that has just come through massive reorganization and restructuring through a year of the COVID pandemic, navigating that space that is unknown to any of us, and having to face the racial injustice issues within the organization at the same time. I think that's probably been one of my biggest challenges, not just at Christian Aid, but actually in my career. I think it's been tough. It's been tough in terms of staff well-being. It's been tough because of course, as a woman of color myself, when you're having to deal with issues of color blindness within a faith-based organization, and an organization like Christian Aid, where we really pride ourselves on the values that we have and our faith being everything to us. These are some of the things that you really don't want to hear. And yet, I also derive a lot of hope and inspiration from this experience of the last 12 to 18 months, because the anger and the rage that came from members of staff at that injustice of perceived and experienced injustice was channeled inside the organization to create hope that we were actually going to come through this. And so I could talk about a lot of things that we out there with partners, but I think I want to actually dedicate this intervention to the staff and the trustees of Christian Aid. Because I'm telling you, over the last 18 months, they have been through quite a lot of challenges. And yet, they've continued to pull the organization together. They've continued to deliver in Myanmar, where we are having challenges, in Nigeria, where we're having challenges, humanitarian interventions, development challenges. What I have experienced is a hope that actually surpasses all understanding from our staff, and such a commitment to ensure that somehow that work, the purpose and mission of Christian Aid that was established 75 years ago, that is going to continue to have meaning. So yes, it has been extremely challenging, but I've been surrounded by people. Just very quickly, our partners in South Africa said to me, although we no longer have a financial partnership with you, we are now standing in solidarity as brothers and sisters. And so we are here for you when you need us. In my conversations with supporters during this lockdown, again, the questions that I heard, whether it was in Scotland, Wales, or here in England, was, what can we do? How can we help you? The understanding was incredible. I think the last thing, Chine, is personal faith. And I have prayed, I think, more than ever before. And I believe that during this time when it has been really difficult during this season, I think God has been right in the middle of our work. So I have found a lot of support and comfort and inspiration within that.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I just want to add that I'm so proud of Christian Aid for, over the past 30 years, the 4 people who have led the organisation come from diverse backgrounds. It's amazing that we have had over that time a white woman, a white man, a black woman, and an Asian man. I think not many organisations have done that, and it's been a privilege to bring you all together. We have got lots of great questions in the chat box. I'm going to hand over to Wendy.
Thanks, Ginny. Yes, lots and lots of amazing questions. Let's get started. Amanda, you finished with the language of faith, and I think there's a number of questions that raise questions around the role of faith in development, and in particular, given that we're living in such a culture of fear and even anxiety, and how that can be used to control and manipulate, how might Christian Aid, from its lessons in the past and as it thinks about the future, address fear with faith? So I'll put that. I'll give you a second. Maybe start with you, Amanda. Thank you. Okay.
I think faith has to be a personal experience to start with, and I think that it's for me during this season, what I have found is that I have strengthened my relationship with God, right? And it's not just praying, but it's also being in fellowship with others. And it's being able to see that faith is not just a belief system, but it's a lived experience. You know, you get up in the morning, and I've got a friend of mine who says she gets up in the morning. She works with young people in London. And during the time when everybody was fearful of actually going out for fear of catching COVID, she's a critical worker. She said she was getting on the bus every morning, exposing herself, putting herself at risk. And she said every day she prayed and said, God, you are with me, right? So for her, the whole element of faith was not something that is sort of superfluous. It was a real, tangible, lived experience. And I think how we bring it into Christian Aid is remembering that we work with people of faith and none, right? Right across, inside and outside. I think it's important for people to experience the manifestation of faith. So the tangible things of faith, compassion, empathy, those things have to become very tangible in how we work and what we do. And I think that's what came across when we're talking about the racial injustice, the color blindness, being able to listen to our staff who said, look, for the past 10, 15 years, we have not enjoyed the same experience as others. Really sitting down and saying, as a Christian, as a person of faith, what do I need to do, right? And that's the only way that I can explain it. I hope that makes sense. But for me, I go back to the word. I look at all the promises that God has made, and I remind myself of those promises every day. I will not leave you, I will not forsake you. I remind myself of that, and then I share that with everybody that comes into contact with me.
Thank you, Amanda. Loretta, I see your camera is on.
Thank you. I was thinking, as Amanda was talking about the road to Emmaus, you know, when hope seemed very long way off. And yet at that time when hope seemed very far off, that's when the risen Jesus walked beside the two. And I think we often forget that in our moments of pain, you know, there is an opportunity to tune in maybe to listen to the stories of strangers, to enter into a conversation, to listen out for where God is walking with us. And they obviously didn't realize that Jesus was walking with them till they were at the table together, and there was the breaking of the bread and so on. And so I remember then just how, when we feel that anger and that pain, if you listen to the stories of people in communities that we've worked with, that is often where I find hope. When Christian Aid shares stories from all around the world, not necessarily stories of great, agreements being struck at the international level. I don't mean that. I mean, actually in the small conversations, God breaks through. And that's often where I find the moments of real hope that overcomes a fear.
Thank you, Loretta. Michael, Daleep, any comments on the role of faith overcoming fear? Michael, you're on mute, Michael.
Maybe somebody wants me to have the sound turned off. I don't know. I mean, I can only be a bit confessional that I think we have to recognize. I mean, I am often afraid. And it's not a matter of handing out advice about how you deal with it very often. It's, yeah, I am afraid. And I won't go into what I'm afraid of. It's different for all of us. And because of where I am in my own journey, and I do regard myself as a Christian, if I may, I find many of what I would call the standard areas of comfort for a Christian believer not very helpful to me. So my agnosticism, which is not something I'm afraid of actually, but a degree of agnosticism doesn't help, with the recognition that I am afraid quite often. And what I do try to think of is, what others have sort of implied, of the numbers of people, vast numbers of people who are far more to fear and are far more afraid. That at least puts it in perspective.
Thank you, Michael, for your honesty as always. You remind me of sort of the thought that there's a reason why it says do not be afraid in the Bible so often. It's because there was so much fear. So thank you for that honest comment on your own admission of fear. Daleep.
I'm not sure what to add to what our other three have said. For me, right through life, I'm afraid about various things, from personal, professional, social, but I've always been a person of faith, because what I chose many years ago to do in my terms of my career was inspired by my faith, putting my faith into action. And once you've got that commitment, which took me as a doctor in India and then to work in Geneva and with the World Council of Churches and around the world visiting people, I was inspired, I was empowered, I was excited about what others were doing and the little part I could play in all of that. So I've learned a lot from people all over the world. And when I came to Britain to be the first director from overseas, I remember being asked by the staff, a traditional question I suppose the directors have been asked, when are you going overseas to see your partners? I said, in case you don't know, I've been a partner for Christian Aid for 25 years before I came here. I'm going to go around visiting our supporters and our churches in the 4 nations. And again, I was inspired. And I realized how important it was to listen to our supporters as also partners and to see what they wanted from their agency. And that also gave me strength, because worshiping with them, experiencing Christian Aid Week with them, looking at the ways they were putting their faith into action, again, I learned so much. And in all humility, I'll say that my faith has grown over the years. And while I still have fear, I think the fear is part of one's nature of being human, I think. But the important thing is, part of being Christian is knowing who will lead us through and what Jesus can mean to us as individuals, as a church, and as an organization. I was so proud that there were 5 Christian development agencies in Britain. Only one of them has the name Christian in its title, Christian Aid. And I remember so many times people said, "Are you going to change the name?" I said, "Certainly not." When we were changing the brand or the logo in my time, which you people are still using, which thank goodness, because I think it's good. But doesn't matter. That's a secondary. I said we can be proud that we are Christian and we are Christian Aid.
Thank you, Daleep. Thank you all. Daleep, I'm going to pick up on your comment on the church and that sense of connection as partnership in the church. We've had a couple of questions in about how change happens. So learning from how to bring about change from your experience and what the most transformative moments have been. And then a particular question around how perhaps the church can change in the instance where it could move beyond recognizing the value of the charitable giving, but moving beyond charitable giving to that more transformational systemic injustice perspective on the work. What tips from your experience would you share with Christian Aid as it seeks to do itself out of existence by its 100th, perhaps?
Whether we're going to put ourselves out of business in another 25 years, I don't know. Sadly, human beings take advantage of the weak, the poor, and the excluded. And unfortunately, there will always be those who are pushed out and left out. But I want to say, during Michael's time, and I took it on, we began to see you could not just solve the problems of poverty and suffering by giving out money to small groups of people all over the world. We had to look at the root causes of poverty, exclusion, and injustice. And we've educated our Christian community and our church community to see the faith is not just about helping with money in a kind of small charity, putting money into the box and hoping it'll make a difference. That we had to do certain things ourselves. What did we shop? Was it fair? How did we invest? Was that right? Should we influence our politician? Was that part of our faith too? And I think we've helped people to put their faith into action, not just by putting money into the box or sending money to Christian Aid, put their faith into action in what they buy, how they shop. Trade justice was about that. Fair trade was about that. So many other things are about that. My exciting thing was to see that the church was getting used to speaking out, standing up, taking sides, taking risks, and getting involved and upsetting a few people. Because if you don't upset a few people, you're not going to change the world.
I'll give you an amen. Loretta, you've got a hand up. I welcome it.
Thank you. So the Church of England, where I'm working now, the Archbishop of York is leading work around a refreshed vision for the church. And I'm really thrilled that there is much talk at the center of this vision about the 5 marks of mission. And the 5 marks of mission as expressed by the Anglican Communion include, of course, acts of what I think we'll call charity in terms of social action, for example, and the Church of England's involved in about 35,000 social action projects across the nation. But the 4th mark of mission is about tackling structural injustices and speaking up and speaking out. And it's great to see the church, reconnecting with the 5 marks of mission. And I hope that we'll see that work its way through in real action. On climate change, the work that the churches did to help us lift up the need for a really strong and fair and robust agreement and go and see their MPs was very, very influential. Organising to see your MPs in Westminster, they'd never seen anything like the way we organised ourselves to do that. And that really, really does make a difference. And the church is also trying to work to get its own house in order much more striving towards net zero inside our own church structures and operations by 2030, which is a very, very, very challenging target. So I'm really pleased that the church is beginning to articulate that, and you know, we'll need to pray and work alongside to hope to bring that into full reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Loretta. Michael, I noticed you unmuted. Is that you coming in with a response to this question on change and change in the church?
Sorry, I'm not there, am I?
We can't see you. We can hear you, but we can't see you. There we go.
I mean, the answer to how do you bring change about is extraordinarily difficult. I don't want to make life even more difficult. And somehow you just have to try various things. Some have been tried and tested and some have not. But what is very clear, and as I think has been said in different ways tonight, and you can't say it too much, is that sort of charitably putting plasters on wounds will change very, very little. And we have to be very clear about that. And that's why this tension between, of course, you've got to meet people in desperate need immediately and do something about it. Nobody's ever argued against that. You know, and of course you've got to have your development projects, which are, I think, a kind of creeping, in a good sense, creeping way. If they're good projects, and they should always be tested by, are they going to actually bring about some significant change in the social and political realities that people live in? Of course, they're important. But if we don't actually try to analyze what are these structures that are actually maintaining people in poverty and destitution and isolation, then we're not serious about it. And, you know, somebody else, I think, talked about love, well, and politics, and I think it was Daleep, but I mean, love isn't love if it's not political, because it's just sort of evading the fundamental issues, which doesn't mean to say you only do the political thing and you don't do the others. But if you do the others and you don't do the political thing, well, you're just not serious about really caring for the best for your neighbour.
Thank you, Michael. Amanda, welcome. Any contribution from you on this, if you so wish?
Thank you, Wendy. I really resonate with what Michael just said. But maybe my contribution to this question is, I think that three things. I think one is perhaps this is a season for us as churches to self-introspect, right? Not to spend too much time doing that. So I'm not saying, you know, let's go all theoretical. But when you look at the discussion on climate injustice, when you look at the economic injustice, and when you look at gender injustice, and I could go on and give you specific examples of the role of faith in a number of injustices around the world, right? Then I think, you know, is this time for us to just say, you know, I guess maybe to paraphrase, use some of Michael's language, you know, what does the love that we talk about really look like, and what does it mean? Okay, there are certain lifestyles choices that we've made. For example, those of us living in wealthier countries and wealthier nations. We're still Christians, but we live in wealthier nations, and those lifestyles are, you know, are fed by quite a lot of the injustice that is happening out there. Okay. And it's certainly something that sometimes I don't want to think about, because there are certain personal comforts that I like, right? But truly, is this time for us to introspect and say, what needs to change in our own structures, our own powers, so that it's not done to us, but we do it to ourselves. That's one. And I think that the second thing is, I think that there's a role for the church in helping collective healing of a broken society. And we are a broken society, not just, I'm not talking about the UK, I'm talking about worldwide. We are a broken society. We have moved away from that initial social contract from the Garden of Eden, right? We need to rebuild, to redefine a new social contract and start putting those pieces together. And I think that we have an opportunity to lead as people of faith. And I think the church becomes the heart it's our sanctuary as people of faith. We go there to get that strength, right? So when we're talking about fear earlier on, what do I do when I finish this meeting? If I'm afraid, I'm anxious, which I have been over the last few months, you know, I go into a prayer room with sisters, with brothers, and I find comfort and peace, right? So let's strengthen the church. We need to ensure that the church is strong, because the work ahead, if I can borrow the words of Jesus to his disciples, you know, when they were trying to cast out demons, and they said, you know, but why did we fail? And he said, some of these things we can only go with prayer and fasting. I think that we really need to rethink about that and just, yeah.
Wonderful, Amanda. Those words of comfort and peace feel like a really wonderful note to hand back. I'm sorry we didn't get to cover more of the questions. Lots of wonderful ideas and questions being raised, but we've only scratched the surface on. But I'll hand back to you, Chinny. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, all. We have come to the end of our evening. Thank you so much to Rowan, to Michael, Daleep, Loretta, and to Amanda, and to Wendy as well. To SPCK's Elizabeth Neep, who commissioned the book, to Sarah Head for helping to organise this event from SPCK, to all our contributors, and to all of you for joining. It has been wonderful, encouraging, but also heart-stirring to hear about the challenges that our world has faced over the past few decades. We are currently facing perhaps our biggest ever crisis, climate change, which is an injustice that's impacting the communities we serve right now, not in a future distant reality. So we at Christian Aid invite you to pray with us without ceasing for our climate and communities around the world by joining our global prayer chain. I will be posting the link in the chat box shortly. But to close this evening, I want to end with a prayer from the book from climate activist and theologian Hannah Malcolm. It's a prayer from Hannah about climate injustice. So let's pray. Merciful God, if I must speak, let it not be my words. They stick to my tongue, to my hands. I trip over unclean lips, and I cannot face my shame. If I must speak, let it not be my words. They are brittle and hard, fall short of tears, refuse to root in this stony soil. If I must speak, let it be my sister's words, my brother's words. Their blood cries out from holy ground. You called them beloved when I did not. If I must speak, let it be Christ's words, whose weeping revived the dead, who was buried a seed, raised a tree, and whose leaves will heal the nations. Amen.